My daughter-in-law shoved me to the ground and said I had failed as a mother, wife, and daughter, in front of the whole family. I spoke just 5 words, and after that, her face turned pale. She realized that day my revenge had begun. I should have seen it coming. The way Jessica's eyes narrowed when I walked into the backyard for my granddaughter Emma's high school graduation party, the way she positioned herself between me and the other guests, like a guard dog protecting territory that was never really hers to claim. At 64, I'd learned to read the signs. 23 years of marriage to my late husband Robert had taught me about subtle cruelties, though his had been born from weakness, not malice. Jessica's cruelty was different, calculated, purposeful, born from a deep well of resentment that I'd never fully understood until that moment when everything changed.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
The party was supposed to be a celebration. Emma had graduated with honors, earned a full scholarship to State University. She was Robert's and my pride and joy, the granddaughter who still hugged me tight and called me Grandma Helen instead of just Helen like her parents insisted she should. Emma was the reason I tolerated these family gatherings, the reason I swallowed my pride and accepted the scraps of belonging that Jessica threw my way. I was wearing my best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, the one I'd bought for Robert's funeral 3 years ago. It was the nicest thing I owned, though I could see Jessica's friends eyeing it with that particular look women give when they're calculating the cost of your outfit and finding you wanting. Their designer sundresses and expensive jewelry caught the afternoon light like small suns, while I stood in their shadows feeling every bit the poor relation they believed me to be. Jessica had insisted the party be held at our house, well, Robert's house that somehow became Robert and Jessica's house after he died, and I became the inconvenient leftover. The backyard looked beautiful, I had to admit. White tents, catered food, flowers everywhere. Nothing like the simple cake and ice cream celebrations we'd had when Robert was alive, when family meant more than appearances. Emma found me by the garden, away from the crowd of her parents' friends and neighbors. She looked radiant in her white graduation dress, her dark hair, so much like Robert's, pinned back with the pearl clips I'd given her that morning. "Grandma Helen," she said, squeezing my arm, "thank you for coming. I know Mom gets weird about these things." Weird. That was Emma's diplomatic way of describing her mother's systematic campaign to minimize my presence in their lives. Ever since Robert died, Jessica had been rewriting the family narrative, editing me out scene by scene until I became nothing more than an occasional background character in my own son's life. "I wouldn't miss your graduation for anything, sweetheart," I told her, meaning every word. "Your grandfather would have been so proud." Emma's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. She was the only one who still talked about Robert, still remembered the man who'd raised my son Michael when his own father disappeared. Jessica preferred to pretend Robert had never existed, that this house, this life, this family had somehow materialized around her by divine right. "Grandma, I wanted to tell you something," Emma began, but her voice was drowned out by Jessica's shrill call from across the yard. "Emma, come here, honey. The photographer wants to get pictures of the family." I watched Emma's face fall slightly. We both knew what family meant in Jessica's vocabulary. It meant the people who mattered, the people worth preserving in photographs. It meant everyone except me. Emma squeezed my hand. "We'll talk later, okay? I promise." But later never came. Later, I was sprawled on the ground in front of 20-some guests, my carefully chosen dress torn at the knee, my dignity scattered like the contents of my purse that had spilled across the patio. The humiliation started small, the way it always did. Jessica steering conversations away from me when I tried to contribute. The subtle but unmistakable way she guided people to the other side of the yard when they approached me. The eye rolls when I complimented the food, or mentioned how proud I was of Emma. By evening, as the party wound down and I was helping collect empty glasses, because that's what I did, what I'd always done, tried to be useful, tried to earn my place, I heard Jessica talking to her friend Marilyn near the kitchen window. "I just don't know what to do with her," Jessica was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when discussing me, like I was a stray cat that had wandered into her perfect life. She shows up looking like she bought her clothes at a thrift store, tries to insert herself into conversations where she doesn't belong. It's embarrassing. "Can't Michael do something?" Marilyn asked. Michael has a soft spot for her because she raised him after his real father left, but honestly, she's becoming a burden. The way she hangs around here all the time, expecting to be included in everything. Some people just don't understand their place. My place. As if I were hired help, rather than the woman who'd loved Robert for 23 years. Who'd helped raise the son Jessica claimed to love. Who'd welcomed her into our family when Michael brought her home 10 years ago. I set down the glasses I'd been collecting and walked toward them, my hands shaking with something I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not hurt. Anger. Pure, clean anger. "Jessica," I said quietly. She turned, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or just annoyance at being overheard. "Helen, I didn't see you there." "I'm sure you didn't." I looked at her, really looked at her. Designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Diamond earrings that caught the porch light. Manicured nails wrapped around a wine glass that cost more than most people spent on dinner. All of it built on a foundation she'd never bothered to question. "I think it's time you knew your place too." The words came out before I could stop them. Quiet but carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the remaining guests. Jessica's face flushed red, then white, then red again. "Excuse me?" But before I could explain, before I could take back the words that had been building inside me for 3 years, Jessica stepped forward. Close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. Close enough that I could see the fury blazing in her eyes. "How dare you?" she hissed. "How dare you come to my home, to my daughter's party, dressed like some homeless woman and think you can speak to me like that? Your home? Your daughter? Or..." Every word was a blade, carefully chosen to cut deep. "Jessica, please," I started, but she wasn't finished. "You've never understood, have you? You've never understood that this isn't your life anymore. Robert is dead. This house, this family, Emma, none of it belongs to you. You're here because we allow it, because Michael feels sorry for you. But don't mistake our charity for actual belonging." The remaining guests had gone silent, watching this confrontation unfold like spectators at an accident. I could see Emma standing in the doorway, her face white with shock. Michael was nowhere to be seen, probably inside getting another drink, oblivious to the fact that his wife was systematically destroying his mother. "You want to know the truth?" Jessica continued, her voice rising. "You failed. As a mother, as a wife, as a daughter. Look at yourself, Helen. Look at your pathetic life. You have nothing. You are nothing. You're just a sad old woman clinging to a family that's moved on without you." That's when she pushed me. Not hard, but I was standing near the edge of the patio, and my feet, unsteady in my good shoes, couldn't find purchase on the smooth stone. I went down hard, my hip hitting the ground first, then my shoulder, the impact jarring through my bones like electricity. The silence that followed was complete. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped chirping. I lay there for a moment, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue, feeling the burn of scraped skin and bruised pride. Around me, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the witnesses, someone's glass hitting the ground and shattering. Jessica stood over me, her chest heaving, her perfectly styled hair slightly mussed from the exertion of her fury. For a moment, she looked almost surprised by what she'd done. Almost. Then her expression hardened again. "Maybe now you'll finally understand where you stand in this family." I pushed myself up to sitting, ignoring the offers of help from the guests who'd found their voices again. My dress was torn at the knee, my purse had spilled open beside me, but I felt strangely calm, clearer than I had in years. I looked up at Jessica, this woman who'd married my son and somehow convinced him that love meant choosing sides. This woman who'd spent 10 years systematically erasing me from my own family's story. "Poor people," I said quietly, brushing dirt from my palms, "can surprise you." The 5 words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples I couldn't see but somehow knew would spread wider than any of us could imagine. Jessica's face went pale. Something in my tone, in the certainty behind those simple words, clearly unsettled her in a way her own cruelty hadn't touched me. "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded, but her voice had lost its edge. I didn't answer. Instead, I collected my scattered belongings, accepted Emma's help getting to my feet, and walked away from the party that had never really been meant for me anyway. But as I drove home to my small apartment, I wasn't thinking about the humiliation or the physical pain. I was thinking about tomorrow, about the phone calls I was going to make, about the conversations I was finally ready to have. Jessica thought she knew who I was, thought she understood my place in the world. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been about everything. The drive home from Emma's graduation party felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. My hands shook on the steering wheel. Whether from adrenaline or delayed shock, I couldn't tell. Every time I stopped at a red light, I caught glimpses of myself in the rearview mirror. Dirt smudged on my cheek, hair falling loose from the careful style I'd spent an hour perfecting that morning. The torn fabric at my knee where I'd hit the concrete. I looked exactly like what Jessica had called me, a pathetic old woman. But as I pulled into the parking lot of Sunset Gardens Apartments, something inside me hardened, not into bitterness, but into something sharper, something that had been sleeping for too long. My apartment was on the second floor, Unit 2B, 1,200 square feet of beige carpet and white walls that I'd called home for the past 3 years. After Robert died, I'd sold the house we'd shared for 23 years and moved here, thinking it would be simpler, thinking it would be enough. I'd been wrong about a lot of things. The first thing I did was pour myself a glass of wine. The cheap kind from the grocery store, not the expensive bottles Jessica served at her parties. Then I sat in my worn armchair, the one piece of furniture I'd insisted on keeping from the old house, and let myself remember. Robert had been gone 3 years, but sometimes the grief still hit me like a physical blow. Not tonight, though. Tonight, I was remembering other things, better things. The man he'd been before the cancer took him. The way he'd looked at me on our wedding day like I was the most precious thing in the world. The way he'd never once made me feel small or ashamed, even when money was tight and we had to count every penny. We'd been poor then, really poor. Robert was building his landscaping business from nothing, working 18-hour days and coming home with dirt under his fingernails and hope in his eyes. I worked at the diner downtown, pulling double shifts and bringing home leftover pie for Michael, who was 7 and going through a growth spurt that seemed to require feeding him every hour. Those were hard years. But they were good years, too. We were building something together. A life, a family, a future that belonged to us. Then Aunt Margaret died. I'd barely known my father's sister. She'd moved to California in the 1960s, married some tech executive, and disappeared from our lives except for Christmas cards with her elaborate signature. Margaret Hartwell. Even her name sounded expensive. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 15 years ago. A lawyer with a crisp voice and news that changed everything. Mrs. Helen Cartwright? I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Hartwell. You're listed as her sole heir. Sole heir. The words didn't make sense at first. Margaret and I had met maybe 3 times in my entire life, but apparently she'd never had children, never remarried after her husband died, and I was the only family she had left. The inheritance was substantial. More substantial than anything I'd ever imagined. Not just money, but investments, property, a trust fund that had been growing for decades, enough to change our lives completely. But Robert and we'd made a decision. We wouldn't let the money change who we were. We'd be careful with it, responsible. We'd use it to secure our future without letting it corrupt our present. So we kept working. Robert expanded his business slowly, carefully. I stayed at the diner for another 5 years before quietly retiring. We helped Michael with college expenses, but we didn't spoil him. We wanted him to understand the value of work, of earning what you had. And we never told anyone about the inheritance. Not Michael, not our friends, not our neighbors. As far as anyone knew, we were just a middle-class family who'd managed to save a little money over the years. The secret had felt romantic then, like a game we were playing. Robert would wink at me when people commented on our modest lifestyle, and I'd squeeze his hand under the table. We called ourselves the stealth millionaires, though we never actually lived like millionaires. We lived like us, just with the security of knowing we'd never have to worry about money again. When Robert got sick, the money meant we could afford the best doctors, the experimental treatments, the private room where he spent his final days surrounded by flowers and family photos. It meant I could take care of him without worrying about lost wages or medical bills. It meant I could grieve without the added burden of financial stress. After he died, I'd thought about telling Michael about the inheritance then, but Jessica had just had Emma. They were struggling with new parent expenses, and I was afraid. afraid they'd see me differently, afraid Jessica would suddenly become interested in a relationship with me for all the wrong reasons. So I'd kept the secret, even as Jessica made it clear that she saw me as a burden. Even as she systematically worked to convince Michael that his mother was just another obligation to manage. For 3 years, I'd watched Jessica treat me like a poor relation, while I quietly maintained the trust funds that would eventually provide for Emma's future. I'd listened to her complaints about money while I made anonymous donations to the charities Robert and I had supported. I'd endured her condescension while I held the power to change all their lives with a single phone call. I'd thought I was being noble, protecting them from the complications that money could bring to family relationships. But sitting in my apartment tonight, tasting blood from my bitten tongue and feeling the ache in my bruised hip, I realized I'd been protecting the wrong person. I'd been protecting Jessica from the truth about who she'd been treating so cruelly all these years. I'd been enabling her cruelty by hiding my true circumstances, letting her believe she was superior to me in every way that mattered to her. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Emma's name flashed on the screen. "Grandma Helen, are you okay? I can't believe what Mom did tonight. I'm so sorry." Her voice was thick with tears, and my heart ached for this beautiful girl caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a few scrapes." "No, you're not fine. What she did was horrible. I tried to talk to Dad, but he's being weird about it. He keeps saying Mom was stressed about the party and things got out of hand." Of course he did. Michael had been making excuses for Jessica's behavior for years, probably without even realizing it. It was easier than admitting he'd married someone capable of such casual cruelty. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. How does your mother talk about me when I'm not around?" There was a long pause. When Emma spoke again, her voice was small. She says you don't understand boundaries, that you're too needy, too dependent on our family. She says you never learned to build a life of your own after Grandpa died." Each word was a small knife, but I'd expected as much. What else? "She says you're jealous of our success, of the life she and Dad have built. She says you resent her for giving Dad and me the stability you never could provide, the stability I never could provide." The irony was almost laughable. "Grandma, you know none of that's true, right? You know I love you, and so does Dad, even if he's being stupid right now." I smiled despite everything. Emma was so much like Robert had been at her age, fierce in her loyalties, unwilling to accept injustice, even when it would be easier to look the other way. "I know, sweetheart, and I love you too, more than you'll ever know." "What are you going to do? Are you going to talk to Dad?" I looked around my small apartment, at the thrift store furniture and discount store decorations that Jessica's friends had judged so harshly tonight. At the careful budget sheets I kept on my kitchen table, maintaining the illusion of fixed income living while my actual assets grew in accounts Jessica had never dreamed existed. "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago," I told Emma. "I'm going to stop pretending to be someone I'm not." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room and made a list. Not of grievances, though I had plenty of those. Not of revenge fantasies, though Jessica's shocked face when I'd spoken those 5 words had been satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. I made a list of truths. Things that needed to be said, relationships that needed to be clarified, pretenses that needed to end. At the top of the list, I wrote, "Tell Michael about the inheritance." It was time for my son to understand who his mother really was. Time for him to make his own choices about what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of family he wanted to have. Time for Jessica to learn that poor people could indeed surprise you, especially when they'd never actually been poor at all. I spent the next hour going through my financial documents, pulling together bank statements and investment reports that would tell the real story of Helen Cartwright's circumstances. Tomorrow, I would call my financial advisor. Tomorrow, I would schedule a meeting with Michael that Jessica wouldn't be able to derail or control. Tomorrow, I would stop being the victim in my own story. But tonight, I allowed myself to imagine Jessica's face when she realized that the pathetic old woman she'd humiliated at Emma's graduation party could buy and sell her precious lifestyle 10 times over. The thought shouldn't have brought me as much satisfaction as it did, but after 3 years of swallowing my pride and accepting scraps of belonging in my own son's life, I discovered I had a taste for justice after all. The morning after Emma's graduation party, I woke with purpose for the first time in months. My hip ached from the fall, and there was a purple bruise blooming along my shoulder, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I had coffee and toast at my small kitchen table while reviewing the financial documents I'd gathered the night before. 15 years of careful investment management had turned Aunt Margaret's inheritance into something even more substantial. My financial advisor, William Chen, had done excellent work growing the portfolio while I lived off my Social Security and Robert's modest pension. At 9 o'clock sharp, I called William's office. "Mrs. Cartwright, what a pleasant surprise," he said when his assistant put me through. "It's been what? 6 months since our last quarterly review? William, I need to schedule a meeting, and I need you to prepare something for me." "Of course. What can I help you with?" I explained what I needed without going into the personal details. William had been managing my money long enough to know I wasn't prone to impulsive decisions. If I was asking for a comprehensive portfolio summary and liquidity options, I had my reasons. "I can have everything ready by tomorrow afternoon. Should I prepare anything else? Transfer authorizations? Trust documentation?" "Not yet. But William, I think it's time my family learned the truth about our situation." There was a pause. William had met Michael and Jessica once, at Robert's funeral. Professional courtesy demanded he say nothing about their obvious assumptions regarding my financial status, but I'd seen his carefully neutral expression when Jessica made pointed comments about funeral costs and my retirement planning. "I see. Well, Mrs. Cartwright, I think that's probably overdue. Your current lifestyle choices have been conservative." Conservative. That was William's polite way of saying I'd been living like a pauper while sitting on enough money to last several lifetimes. After scheduling the appointment, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I drove to Michael and Jessica's neighborhood, not to visit but to observe, to see my son's life from the outside, the way a stranger might. I parked across the street from the house where I'd lived for 23 years with Robert, the house we'd bought when Michael was 8, where we'd hosted birthday parties and Christmas mornings and graduation celebrations, where Robert had died in our bedroom upstairs, holding my hand and telling me he loved me with his last coherent breath. Jessica had changed everything. The warm yellow paint Robert and I had chosen was now a stark white. The front garden, where Robert had grown tomatoes and sunflowers, was now a formal landscape of ornamental grasses and expensive shrubs. Even the front door was different, painted black instead of the forest green we'd picked, because it reminded us of the mountains where we'd honeymooned. It looked like a magazine photo, perfect, expensive, and utterly without personality. I was sitting there, remembering what the house used to look like, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A truck was parked in the driveway, not Michael's truck, which I would have recognized. This was a locksmith's van, and through the living room window, I could see Jessica talking animatedly to a man with a clipboard. My hands went numb on the steering wheel. She was changing the locks. I watched in fascination and growing horror as the locksmith worked on the front door. The door I'd walked through countless times, carrying groceries and birthday presents and Christmas gifts for Emma. The door that had never been locked against me in all the years I'd been part of this family. Until now. 20 minutes later, the locksmith finished his work and left. Jessica closed the door behind him with what looked like satisfied finality. She was making sure I could never enter that house again without her explicit permission. I sat in my car for another hour, processing what I'd witnessed. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision born from last night's confrontation. This was planned, calculated. Jessica had probably scheduled this locksmith days ago, maybe even before the graduation party. She'd pushed me to the ground in front of witnesses, humiliated me publicly, and then systematically ensured I could never surprise her by showing up unannounced again. The woman was more strategic than I'd given her credit for. My phone rang, Michael's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. "Hi, honey. Mom." His voice was strained, uncomfortable. "We need to talk." "I agree. When would be good for you?" "Well, that's the thing. Jessica thinks it would be better if we had some space for a while, just until everyone calms down from last night." Space. The universal code word for banishment. "I see. And what do you think, Michael?" A long pause. "I think maybe Jessica has a point. You were pretty aggressive last night, Mom. That comment you made to her, it was uncalled for." I almost laughed. I'd been pushed to the ground, humiliated in front of my granddaughter's friends, called a failure as a mother and wife, and my son thought I was the one being aggressive. What comment was that exactly? The thing about poor people. Jessica said it sounded like a threat. Of course she did. Jessica was already working to control the narrative, to paint herself as the victim of my mysterious outburst. Michael, do you remember the house you grew up in? The one where you learned to ride a bike in the driveway and built that treehouse in the backyard with your father? Mom? What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember how your father and I worked to provide for you? How we made sure you never went without, even when money was tight? Of course I remember. You and Dad were great parents. That's not what this is about, but it was exactly what this was about. It was about respect, about family, about the difference between earning your place and demanding it. Michael, I'd like to take you to lunch tomorrow, just the two of us. There are some things about our family's situation that I think you should know. Mom, I don't think that's a good idea right now. Jessica's really upset and I need to focus on my family. His family, not our family, not the family that included me. His family, which apparently consisted of Jessica and Emma and no one else. I understand, I said quietly. But Michael, when you're ready to hear the truth about a few things, call me. I'll be waiting. After we hung up, I drove home and did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called my old friend Patricia, who'd moved to Florida after her husband died. Helen, oh my God, it's been too long. How are you holding up? Patricia had known Robert and me when we were struggling to build our landscaping business. She'd also known us after Aunt Margaret's inheritance, though she was one of the few people who'd ever been told about it. Patricia understood the burden of keeping family secrets. I need advice, Pat, about money and family, and when keeping secrets stops being protection and starts being enabling. I told her everything. The years of Jessica's subtle cruelty, the gradual isolation from my son, last night's humiliation, and this morning's locksmith. Jesus, Helen. You've been letting this woman treat you like garbage while you're sitting on more money than she'll see in her lifetime? I was trying to protect Michael. To let him love her without the complication of knowing about the inheritance. Honey, you weren't protecting Michael. You were protecting Jessica from the consequences of her own nastiness. And look where it got you. Patricia was right, and I knew it. I'd been so afraid of money changing my relationships that I'd allowed my relationship with my son to be poisoned by someone who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience. What would you do? I'd stop playing the victim and start playing the game. You've got more power in your little finger than that woman has in her whole body, but you've been acting like you're powerless. Why? It was a good question. Why had I been so willing to accept less and less of my son's attention, less and less respect from his wife, less and less belonging in my own family? Maybe because it was easier than risking disappointment, easier than finding out that Michael might choose Jessica's version of their life over any version that included me as an equal rather than a dependent. But last night had changed something fundamental. When Jessica pushed me to the ground, when she called me a failure, when she told me I had nothing and was nothing, she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I wasn't going to shuffle quietly out of my son's life just because his wife found my existence inconvenient. After talking to Patricia, I spent the afternoon researching something I'd never bothered to look into before. Jessica's background. I'd always accepted Michael's version of their love story, but I realized I'd never actually verified any of it. Jessica claimed to have graduated from State University with a business degree. A few phone calls to their alumni office revealed no record of anyone by her name graduating in the year she'd claimed. She said she'd worked in marketing for a major corporation before Emma was born. But when I searched professional networking sites, I found no employment history matching her timeline. Most interesting of all, I discovered that Jessica had been married before she met Michael. Briefly, to a man named David Kellerman, who'd filed for divorce citing financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd been carefully constructing her identity long before she met my son. A woman who saw marriage as a means to security rather than love. A woman who'd probably targeted Michael specifically because he appeared to be stable, employed, and conveniently without much family to ask uncomfortable questions. By evening, I had enough information to understand exactly who I'd been dealing with all these years. Jessica wasn't just difficult or high maintenance. She was calculating. Everything she'd done to isolate me from Michael had been purposeful, designed to ensure that no one could challenge her version of their life together. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that because I lived modestly and dressed simply, I had no real power to challenge her. Tomorrow, I would begin teaching her just how wrong she'd been about that. William Chen's office was everything you'd expect from a high-end financial advisory firm. Mahogany furniture, expensive art on the walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's financial district. I'd been coming here for 15 years, but I'd always felt like I was playing dress-up, pretending to belong in a world designed for people who wore designer suits and discussed seven-figure portfolios over lunch. Today felt different. Today, I belonged here. William greeted me with his usual professional warmth, but I caught him studying my face as we shook hands. The bruise on my cheek had darkened overnight, and I hadn't bothered trying to cover it with makeup. Let him see what his carefully managed portfolio had been protecting me from. Mrs. Cartwright, I have to say, you look like a woman with a plan. I am, and I need your help executing it. He gestured me toward the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table. The portfolio summary he'd prepared was impressive even by my own standards. Margaret's original inheritance had more than tripled in value through careful investment and compound growth. The numbers on the page represented more money than most people saw in several lifetimes. As you can see, your current net worth is approximately $12.8 million, William said, his voice carefully neutral. The majority is in diversified investments, but you have substantial liquid assets available if needed. 12.8 million. I let the number settle in my mind. Meanwhile, Jessica was probably calculating how to stretch their grocery budget to accommodate her expensive tastes. William, I need you to help me understand something. If I wanted to make a significant purchase tomorrow, something substantial, what would that process look like? Depends on the amount and the type of purchase. Real estate, business acquisition, charitable giving. Most transactions under $2 million could be processed within 48 hours. I nodded, filing that information away. And if I wanted to establish a trust fund for my granddaughter's education and future needs, very straightforward. We could have the documentation prepared within a week, depending on the structure you prefer. What about college expenses? If someone needed immediate assistance with tuition, housing, that sort of thing, William's expression grew thoughtful. Mrs. Cartwright, may I ask what's prompted this sudden interest in liquidity and educational funding? I told him. Not everything, but enough. About Jessica's treatment of me, about Michael's gradual distance, about Emma being caught in the middle of a family conflict she didn't understand, about the locks being changed and my son asking for space. William listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with new interest. You know, in 15 years of managing your assets, I've never once seen you use your financial position to solve a problem. Most people in your situation would have flexed that muscle years ago. I didn't want money to complicate my family relationships. And how has that worked out for you? It was a fair question. My careful protection of everyone's feelings had resulted in my own systematic humiliation and exclusion. I'd been so afraid of money changing my family dynamics that I'd allowed those dynamics to become toxic anyway. I think it's time for a new approach, I said. William smiled, the first genuinely pleased expression I'd seen from him in years. I think you're absolutely right. Now, what did you have in mind? We spent the next hour mapping out several scenarios, nothing dramatic or vindictive, but strategic moves that would demonstrate the reality of my situation while positioning me to protect Emma's future and my own dignity. The first step was simple but symbolic. I was going to buy a house. Not a mansion or an estate that would scream new money, but something comfortable and substantial. Something that would make it clear that Helen Cartwright had choices. There's a property that came on the market yesterday, William said, pulling up listings on his computer. Beautiful colonial in Riverside Heights. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, lovely garden. It's been owned by the Hendersons for 30 years, but they're moving to Florida. I knew the neighborhood. Jessica had driven me through it once, pointing out houses and making wistful comments about how wonderful it would be to live somewhere so prestigious. She'd sighed dramatically and said, maybe someday, when Michael's business was more established, they could afford to move there. The house William showed me was perfect, traditional but welcoming, with the kind of established gardens Robert would have loved. The asking price was $850,000. I'll take it, I said. William blinked. Don't you want to see it first? I want to make an offer today. Full asking price, cash, no contingencies. How quickly can we close? With a cash offer? 2 weeks, maybe less. Perfect. That would give me time to arrange the other pieces of my plan. After leaving William's office, I drove to State University. Emma was starting classes in the fall, and I had an appointment with the financial aid office that I'd scheduled under a false pretense. The financial aid counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, greeted me warmly when I explained that I was Emma's grandmother and wanted to understand her aid package. Emma Morrison? Yes, I remember her application. Excellent student, strong SAT scores. She's received some merit-based aid, but the family's financial situation means she'll need substantial loans to cover the remaining costs. I nodded thoughtfully. What would happen if someone wanted to, say, establish a scholarship or endowment that would cover her remaining expenses? Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes lit up. That would be wonderful. We have several options for private scholarships. The donor can choose to remain anonymous or be publicly recognized. The process is quite straightforward. Anonymous, I said immediately, and I'd want it structured so that Emma never worries about money again. Full tuition, room and board, books, everything. That's incredibly generous. May I ask what prompted this? I thought about Emma's face last night, the tears in her eyes as she watched her mother push me to the ground, the way she'd called me afterward, apologizing for something that wasn't her fault. Education shouldn't be a financial burden, I said. It should be a gift. By the time I left the university, Emma's entire college education was funded through an anonymous scholarship that would be announced the following week. The total cost was barely a rounding error in my overall portfolio, but it would change Emma's life completely. My next stop was the most challenging one. I drove to Michael's office, the small accounting firm where he'd worked for the past 8 years. I'd only been there once before when he'd first been hired, but I remembered the location. The receptionist looked confused when I asked to see Michael. I'm sorry, but Mr. Morrison is in meetings all afternoon. Can I schedule something for next week? I'm his mother, I said simply. Tell him Helen Cartwright is here, and that I have something important to discuss with him about Emma's future. 5 minutes later, Michael appeared in the lobby, looking harried and uncomfortable. Mom, what are you doing here? I told you we needed some space. This isn't about space, Michael. This is about Emma. Can we talk privately for a few minutes? He glanced around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable with having this conversation in his workplace. Let me grab my jacket. We can walk outside. The small park across from his office building was mostly empty on a weekday afternoon. We sat on a bench under an oak tree that reminded me painfully of the one in his childhood backyard, before Jessica had it removed for being too messy. Mom, if this is about last night, it's not. It's about Emma's college expenses. I know you and Jessica are worried about the financial burden. Michael's shoulders sagged slightly. We'll figure it out. Maybe she can take out loans, work part-time. Lots of kids do it. She won't have to. I've arranged for her education to be fully funded. He stared at me. What do you mean, fully funded? I mean, she's received an anonymous scholarship that will cover everything. Tuition, room and board, books, living expenses. She can focus on her studies instead of worrying about money. Mom, that's incredible. How did you manage that? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The moment when I stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't. I made some phone calls, used some connections I've had for years. Michael was still processing this information. What kind of connections? I took a breath and pulled out the portfolio summary William had prepared, the kind that come with having more money than you realize. Michael stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. I watched his eyes scan the numbers, saw the exact moment when he understood what he was looking at. Mom, this says you're worth almost $13 million. That's correct. But how? When? You live in that tiny apartment. You drive a 10-year-old car. You buy your clothes at discount stores. Because I choose to. Because your father and I believed that how you live matters more than what you own. Because I didn't want money to change how people see me or treat me. Michael was quiet for a long time, staring at the numbers. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. Does Jessica know about this? No one knows, except my financial advisor and now you. Why are you telling me now? I thought about Jessica's face when she'd pushed me to the ground, about the locks being changed, about the years of being treated like a burden in my own family. Because I'm tired of being invisible, Michael. I'm tired of letting other people decide what my place should be in this family. I'm tired of watching my granddaughter worry about money when I have the power to help her. Mom, this changes everything. Does it? Does knowing I have money change how you feel about me? Does it change the fact that Jessica pushed me to the ground last night and you asked me to give you space instead of standing up for me? Michael flinched like I'd slapped him. That's not fair, isn't it? Michael, I've been the same person your whole life. The money doesn't change who I am, but it does change what I'm willing to accept from people who think they can treat me poorly because they believe I have no other options. I stood up from the bench, leaving the portfolio summary with him. I'm buying a house, Michael. A real house, in Riverside Heights. I'm done pretending to be poor to make other people comfortable. Emma will never worry about money again, and you need to decide what kind of man you want to be and what kind of family you want to have. As I walked away, I heard him call after me. Mom, wait, we need to talk about this more. But I didn't turn around. For the first time in 3 years, I was the one walking away from a conversation instead of being dismissed from it. The drive home gave me time to think about what I'd just set in motion. By tomorrow, Michael would tell Jessica about the money. Within days, Jessica's entire understanding of her position in this family would be shattered. I thought I'd feel more satisfaction about that prospect. Instead, I mostly felt tired. But as I pulled into the parking lot of my modest apartment complex for what would probably be the last time, I realized something important had changed. I wasn't afraid anymore. The phone started ringing at 6:30 in the morning, 3 days after my conversation with Michael. I let it go to voicemail the first time, but when it rang again immediately, I knew the news had finally reached Jessica. Her voice on the voicemail was strained, artificially sweet in the way that meant she was barely controlling her panic. Helen, hi, it's Jessica. I was hoping we could talk today. I think there's been a misunderstanding about what happened at Emma's party, and I'd really like to clear the air. Could you call me back? Thanks. I deleted the message without returning the call. Jessica could wait. After 3 years of being available at her convenience, of accepting her schedule and her terms for every interaction, I was discovering the power of making someone else wait for my attention. The second call came an hour later. This time, Jessica's voice had lost its false sweetness. Helen, it's me again. Michael mentioned that you've been talking about some financial arrangements for Emma, and I think we really need to discuss this as a family. Please call me back today. Financial arrangements, not scholarship or gift. Jessica was already trying to minimize what I'd done, to frame it as something that required her approval or oversight. The third call came just before noon, and this time Jessica's mask had slipped completely. Helen, I know you're getting these messages. We need to talk. Today. There are things Michael thinks he understands that need to be clarified. I'm coming over at 2 o'clock whether you like it or not. I almost laughed. Jessica thought she could still intimidate me, still demand access to my time and space on her terms. She had no idea how much the balance of power had shifted. But I was curious about what she planned to say, what strategy she'd developed for handling this new reality. So at 2 o'clock, when she knocked on my apartment door, I let her in. She looked terrible. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and she was wearing jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt instead of her usual carefully curated outfits. We need to talk, she said, pushing past me into my living room. I'm sorry, Jessica, but I don't remember inviting you in. She whirled around, her face flushed with anger. Cut the act, Helen. Michael told me about your little performance at his office, about the money. What about it? Where did it come from? Because I've known you for 10 years, and you've never had 2 nickels to rub together. You live in this dump. You dress like you shop at thrift stores. You've never even offered to help when we've struggled with bills. I sat down in my armchair, the one piece of furniture from my old life that Jessica had always criticized as shabby and outdated. Today, it felt like a throne. I live modestly because I choose to. I dress simply because expensive clothes don't matter to me. And I've never offered to help with your bills because you've never asked. You've only complained. Jessica started pacing my small living room like a caged animal. This is insane. People don't just hide millions of dollars while living like paupers. It doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense if you understand the difference between having money and needing to prove you have money. So what? You've been playing some kind of game, pretending to be poor while secretly judging us? The accusation hung in the air between us. Jessica had found the angle she wanted to take, the way to make herself the victim in this situation. I was the manipulative rich woman who'd been deceiving her poor, innocent family. I wasn't judging anyone, Jessica. I was protecting my family from the complications that money can bring to relationships. Complications like what? Like this conversation. She stopped pacing and stared at me. You think I'm only being nice to you because of the money? Are you being nice to me? The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling to find a response that wouldn't sound ridiculous. I've always been respectful. You pushed me to the ground 3 days ago and told me I was a failure as a mother, wife, and daughter. I was upset about the party. Things got out of hand. You changed the locks on what used to be my house. Jessica's face went white. She hadn't expected me to know about that. Michael thought it would be better if we had some boundaries. Michael didn't know about the locks, Jessica. I saw the locksmith truck the morning after the party. You planned that before you ever pushed me down. For a moment, Jessica looked genuinely trapped. Then her expression hardened into something uglier than anger. Desperation. Fine. You want the truth? Yes, I changed the locks. Yes, I think you're a manipulative old woman who's been playing mind games with this family for years. And yes, I think Michael deserves better than a mother who lies about everything. What have I lied about? Everything. Your financial situation, your needs, your dependence on us. Do you have any idea how guilty Michael's felt about your living situation? How many times he's talked about whether we should invite you to move in with us because he was worried about you being able to afford rent? The irony was rich. While I'd been living modestly to avoid being seen as a burden, Jessica had been using my apparent poverty as a weapon against Michael's conscience. Did he offer to have me move in? Jessica's silence was answer enough. Of course he didn't. Because you made sure he never got the chance to make that offer. We needed our space. Emma needed stability. Emma needed her grandmother. But you decided she needed distance from me more. Jessica sat down heavily on my couch, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking completely. What do you want, Helen? You've got the money. You've got Michael feeling guilty about everything. You've made yourself look like the victim. What's your end game here? It was a fair question. What did I want? For 3 years, I'd wanted to belong in my son's life, to be valued as his mother rather than tolerated as an obligation. I'd wanted to watch my granddaughter grow up, to be part of her milestones and memories. But sitting across from Jessica, seeing the calculation behind her desperation, I realized I wanted something else now, something I'd never allowed myself to want before. I wanted to matter. I want respect, I said simply. I want to be treated like a valued member of this family instead of an inconvenience. I want my granddaughter to know she can count on me. And I want my son to remember that his mother is someone worth defending. And if we can't give you that, then you'll discover that poor people can indeed surprise you. Jessica leaned forward, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a persuasive whisper. Helen, we can fix this. We can start over. I know I haven't always been perfect, but we're family. We can work through this. Family. That's interesting. When exactly did I become family to you? Because it wasn't at Emma's graduation party. I was stressed about the party, about Emma's future, about money. You were worried about money? The woman who just spent $8,000 redoing your kitchen was worried about money? Jessica's mouth fell open. How did you know about the kitchen? I know about a lot of things, Jessica, including your online shopping habits and your credit card debt. It was a bluff, but a good one. Jessica's face told me I'd hit close to home. That's none of your business. You're right. Your finances aren't my business. Just like mine weren't yours until you decided to make assumptions about my situation. Jessica stood up abruptly. I need to think about this. This whole conversation, everything Michael told me, it's a lot to process. Of course it is. Finding out that the woman you've been treating like garbage for 3 years has enough money to buy your lifestyle 10 times over must be quite an adjustment. She started toward the door, then turned back. What about Emma? Are you going to use this money to turn her against us too? Emma already knows where she stands with me. Unlike some people, I don't need to buy her affection. After Jessica left, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about what had just happened. For the first time in our relationship, Jessica had been the one asking for something instead of dismissing me. For the first time, she'd been the one trying to manage my reaction instead of the other way around. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like sadness. Not for Jessica, who was finally facing the consequences of her own choices, but for the years we'd all lost to her manipulations and my own passivity. My phone rang an hour later. Michael's name on the screen. Mom, Jessica came home really upset. She said you two had a difficult conversation. We had an honest conversation. Sometimes that's difficult. She thinks you're angry about the money situation and taking it out on her. What do you think, Michael? A long pause. I think I don't know what to think anymore. 3 days ago, I thought my mother was struggling to make ends meet on Social Security. Now I find out you're a millionaire who's been secretly funding my daughter's education. I feel like I don't know you at all. I'm the same person I've always been. The only thing that's changed is what you know about my financial situation. But why hide it? Why let us worry about you? Let Jessica think you were some kind of burden. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have. Because I've seen what money does to families, how it changes relationships and creates obligations that have nothing to do with affection. And now? I thought about Jessica's desperate attempts to rewrite our history, her sudden interest in being family, now that she understood the real power dynamic. Now I realize that hiding my circumstances didn't protect our relationship. It just allowed people to treat me poorly without consequences. Mom, what happens now? How do we move forward from here? That depends on you, Michael. On what kind of man you choose to be and what kind of family you want to have. After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on my small balcony, watching the sunset over the city. Tomorrow, I would call William about finalizing the house purchase. Tomorrow, I would start planning the next phase of my life. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in years, the quiet satisfaction of being exactly who I was, without apology or explanation. Jessica thought she could manage this new reality, manipulate her way back into controlling the family narrative. She was about to learn how wrong she was about that too. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new kitchen, watching Emma help me arrange flowers from the garden when my phone rang. Michael's name on the screen no longer made my stomach clench with anxiety the way it used to. These days, our conversations were honest, even when they were difficult. Hi, honey. How was your week? Complicated, he said with a sigh. Jessica's been pushing for us to have dinner together. All of us. She thinks enough time has passed that we should try to heal as a family. I smiled, continuing to trim the stems of the roses I'd planted when I first moved into the house on Riverside Heights. The house that had become everything I'd never known I wanted. Peaceful, comfortable, and entirely mine. What do you think about that? I think Jessica's finally realized that her strategy of waiting for things to go back to normal isn't working. It wasn't working because there was no normal to go back to. The revelation of my financial circumstances had shattered the careful dynamics Jessica had spent years constructing, and she was still struggling to find her footing in a world where I couldn't be dismissed or controlled. Emma, sweetheart, could you get those vases from the pantry? I asked my granddaughter, who'd been spending weekends with me since I moved into the house. Sure, Grandma. The blue ones or the crystal ones? Your choice. Emma had flourished this year, free from financial stress about college, secure in the knowledge that her education was fully funded. She'd thrown herself into her studies with the kind of joy that comes from pure intellectual curiosity rather than pressure to succeed. She'd also become my closest ally. The bridge between the life I'd built for myself and the family I still loved, despite everything. Michael, I said, returning to our conversation, do you want to have dinner with Jessica and me? I want to have dinner with my mother and my wife without feeling like I'm choosing sides, but I don't know if that's possible anymore. It was an honest answer, and I appreciated his honesty. The past 6 months had been difficult for Michael. He'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about his marriage and his own role in my gradual exclusion from their lives. That kind of self-reflection is never easy, especially when it involves admitting you've allowed someone you love to be hurt. What would make it possible? I don't know. Jessica keeps saying she wants to apologize, but every time she tries, it turns into an explanation of why she acted the way she did. She doesn't seem to understand that explaining isn't the same as taking responsibility. Emma returned with the vases, and I caught her rolling her eyes at her father's comment. At 18, Emma had developed a clearer understanding of her mother's behavior than Michael had managed in 10 years of marriage. "Mom's been weird ever since she found out about the money," Emma said, not bothering to lower her voice. "She keeps asking me about your house, about whether you've said anything about changing your will, about whether you're planning any big trips." "Emma," Michael said, his voice carrying a warning tone. "What? It's true. She's being obvious about it, Dad. Yesterday she suggested that maybe we should all take a family vacation together, somewhere expensive. She said Grandma Helen probably has travel ideas since she has the resources now." I wasn't surprised. Jessica had been testing various approaches for months, trying to find an angle that would restore her influence. The vacation suggestion was particularly transparent, an attempt to position herself as the facilitator of my newfound spending power. "What did you tell her?" I asked Emma. "That if I wanted to travel with you, I'd ask you directly. Which I am, by the way. Can we go to Italy next summer? I want to see the art museums before I graduate." "Of course we can." Michael was quiet for a moment. "Mom, can I ask you something? Are you happy with all of this? With how everything changed?" It was a question I'd been asking myself regularly. Was I happy? Or was I just relieved to finally be in control of my own circumstances? "I'm at peace," I said finally. "For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I belong. Living exactly as I choose. That feels better than happy. It feels right." The conversation with Michael ended with tentative plans for lunch the following week. Just the two of us. No Jessica. No pressure to reconcile or forgive or pretend that the past hadn't happened. Just a mother and son trying to rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by years of manipulation and misunderstanding. After Emma left that evening, I walked through my house, something I still did regularly, the evening light through the tall windows, the sound of my heels on the hardwood floors, the sight of my books on shelves that belonged to me. All of it still felt slightly surreal after years of living in spaces that were tolerated rather than owned. My phone buzzed with a text message. Jessica's name appeared on the screen for the first time in 3 months. "Helen, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to say some things. Could we meet for coffee? I promise I'm not asking for anything. I just want to talk. Please." I stared at the message for a long time. The old Helen would have agreed immediately, would have been grateful for any attempt at reconciliation. The new Helen had different priorities. But I was also curious. What did Jessica want to say that couldn't be said through Michael? What angle was she working now? I typed back, "Tomorrow at 2 p.m., the cafe on 5th and Main. 1 hour. She responded within seconds. "Thank you. I'll be there." The next afternoon, I arrived at the cafe deliberately 5 minutes late. Jessica was already there, sitting at a corner table, looking smaller somehow than I remembered. She'd lost weight, and there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "You said you had something to say." Jessica wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm herself. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About how I treated you, about what I said and did." I waited, not helping her with words or encouragement. This was her conversation to have. "I want to apologize, not explain or justify. Just apologize. I was cruel to you. I was threatened by your relationship with Michael and Emma, and I handled that in the worst possible way." It was better than her previous attempts, but I could hear the careful phrasing, the therapy speak that suggested she'd been coaching herself for this conversation. "Why were you threatened?" Jessica looked genuinely surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, why did my relationship with my son and granddaughter threaten you? What did you think I was going to take from you?" She was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought you were going to make them realize I wasn't good enough for them." The honesty of it caught me off guard. For the first time in our relationship, Jessica had said something that felt completely true. Good enough how? I didn't grow up like Michael did. I didn't have parents who stayed married, who built something together, who created the kind of home where love was just assumed. I had to fight for everything, had to prove I deserved it. And then I married Michael, and suddenly I had this family, this life that felt too good to be true. So you decided to eliminate the competition? I decided to protect what I had, but I did it by trying to make you smaller instead of making myself better, and I'm sorry for that. I studied Jessica's face, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. Instead, I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine shame. What do you want from me now? I want to not be the reason Michael feels like he has to choose between his wife and his mother. I want Emma to be able to love both of us without feeling guilty about it. I want to stop being the villain in this family story. And how do you propose to do that? Jessica met my eyes directly for the first time since I'd arrived. By accepting that you're not my competition. You're Michael's mother and Emma's grandmother, and you deserve to be treated with the respect that comes with those relationships. I can't take back what I did, but I can stop doing it. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No tears, no grand gestures, no movie-worthy reconciliation. Just two women acknowledging the truth about their relationship and the damage that had been done. I don't need us to be friends, Jessica, but I won't accept being treated as less than I am. I understand. And if you ever push me to the ground again, metaphorically or literally, you'll discover that poor people can surprise you in ways you haven't imagined yet. For the first time since I'd known her, Jessica laughed. A real laugh, not the brittle social sounds she usually made. I believe you, and I won't. We finished our coffee in relative peace, making tentative plans for Emma's birthday dinner the following month. Nothing was fixed, and trust would take time to rebuild, but something fundamental had shifted. As I drove home to my beautiful house with its perfect garden and peaceful rooms, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the inheritance I'd hidden for so long, the years of accepting less than I deserved, the moment when I'd finally decided to stop being invisible. Jessica would never be the daughter-in-law I'd once hoped for, but she might become someone I could coexist with. Michael was slowly rebuilding his understanding of who I was and what I meant to his family. Emma had never wavered in her love, and now she had the security to pursue any future she chose. I was 64 years old, financially secure, living in a home I loved, and finally occupying the space in my family that I'd always deserved. It had taken me far too long to learn that respect isn't something you earn by making yourself smaller. It's something you claim by refusing to accept anything less. That evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about anyone else's comfort or convenience or opinion. I was simply, completely, unapologetically myself, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.